Afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. My name is Eric Kimberling here on today's live recording of our Transformation Ground Control podcast. We're going to cover today, in today's interview, we're going to cover executive leadership responsibilities in digital transformation. So we're really going to dive into the roles and responsibilities and expectations that executives and leaders can and should have as it relates to their digital transformations. So whether you're a leader within an organization or if you're working with leaders within an organization, we're going to talk about how to get that alignment, the buy-in, the expected roles and responsibilities, all that good stuff we're going to dive into here in today's conversation. Again, my name is Eric Kimberling. I'm going to introduce our guest in just a moment. But in the meantime, I'll introduce myself. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach their third stage of digital transformation success. And I'm also the host of Transformation Ground Control, the podcast that you can find every Wednesday, new episodes on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And it also is dropped onto audio podcast platforms every Wednesday as well. The easiest way to find past episodes is just to go to transformationgroundcontrol.com. That's where you can find the aggregation of all the different platforms and whatnot. So transformationgroundcontrol.com is the podcast, and this interview will be part of the episode that gets released a week from tomorrow. So Wednesday of next week will feature this interview. So thank you for being part of the live production of the podcast here today. Again, today's topic, executive leadership responsibilities and digital transformations. I'm going to start off with some questions here in a moment once I introduce our guest, but who I really want to hear from is from the audience. I would love to hear questions and comments from the audience as we go here. So if you have questions for my guest or I along the way as we're getting into this conversation, please drop those in the chat wherever you're listening or watching here today. And speaking of the chat, if you don't mind just dropping in the chat where in the world you're joining from today, what city and country are you in? We always love to see where the global audience is joining from on any given day that we do these live discussions. So just drop in the chat where you're joining from today. Both my guest and I, just FYI, are joining from the Denver metro area here in Denver, Colorado in the US. So I'd love to hear where the rest of you are joining from here today as well. So to introduce this topic, to discuss this topic in more detail on executive leadership responsibilities in digital transformation, I thought it'd be great to have a first-time guest on the show, Julie Williamson. Julie, thank you for being here today.
Yeah, first-time guest, long-time listener. Isn't that what I'm supposed to say?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for being a guest and a listener.
Yeah.
So I've known you for a long time, Julie, but the audience may not know you. So maybe tell us a little bit about you personally, as well as Karrikins Group and what you guys do.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And thank you so much for having us here. As a managing partner at Karrikins Group, my business partner, Bruce Siegel, and I have the incredible privilege of leading a small and mighty team of people who are really focused on bringing together an intersection of technology, business consulting experience, business acumen, and social science to help drive behavior change in organizations. And at the heart of what we do, it's really trying to understand how we can activate change in organizations as they go through transformation, as they seek to grow, as they look to have a bigger impact in their communities and with their customers. So that's the heart of what Karrikins Group does. And for me, I bring my background into that. As you know, I spent most of the 90s doing big tech implementations. So I come from that world. And then a lot of the early 2000s doing strategy work, and then kind of folded in the social science piece of it in the last 10 to 15 years as we've really leaned into this idea of behavior change. So I'm excited to be here to talk to you about leader activation. It's a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And as you know, it gets me really excited. So here we go.
And that's why I thought it'd be great to have you here, is because what better person to have on this topic than you? One other thing about your background too that you didn't mention, that I didn't refer to you as Dr. Williamson, but you also have a PhD. Could you tell us a little bit about maybe your academic studies and focus over the years?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, I don't know about you, but when I went to college, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And, my parents were like, well, you might want to be able to get a job when you're done. So I went into information systems and tech and, got all of that underway. And it did help me to get a job coming out of school. And then I went back and I got my MBA and I got a concentration in finance. So I kind of had that piece of it. And then I went, off into the world of consulting, and I spent about 10 years working with companies in both tech and in strategy. And I kept seeing the same thing happening over and over again. I would see these really great strategies that totally made sense. I would see, these big systems that were definitely going to help. And we would try and implement them. And then it would just kind of stumble. Like it just never got the traction. And it was clearly an organizational problem, not a technology problem and not a business problem, right? Like the numbers all added up. The tech worked, but they're like the people were broken, right?
Right.
It's kind of like where I was as a young consultant, right? I was like, what is wrong here? And so for me, just the way that I'm wired, I was like, I'm missing something. And so I went back to school and I went into a social science discipline and I got my PhD in organizational communication. And that opened up a whole new field of understanding for me and a new way of looking at organizations and how they work and understanding more theoretically how we collectively create meaning and create understanding, shared understanding of what we need to do and how we're going to do it together. And so I try to infuse all of the work that we do at Karrikins Group with that lens of how do people actually work together to achieve common goals. And that for me has been so rewarding and such a great addition for me in terms of the work that I do and being able to bring that lens into how do we help organizations really move the needle on growth and transformation.
Yeah. Yeah. That's super fascinating. And I've always been fascinated by that dynamic as well. That dynamic of the tech works, but it doesn't work. It's working technically, but it's not working for the organization or for the people. And so that's really what we want to dive into here today. Yeah. So when we talk about change management, though, all the stuff you just mentioned and all the curiosity that you were diving into as part of your PhD and throughout your work experience as well, it all sort of starts with, or should start with, executive alignment. When you think about change management, one of the first things, if not the first thing you need is that executive buy-in and support. So let's start there with the real basics and the fundamentals of executive buy-in and support. What does that mean to you, and why is it important to a digital transformation?
Yeah. Look, we see a huge difference between agreement and alignment. And as executives often agree, yes, we need to transform. And they even sign up to pay millions of dollars for it, right? Like that's cool. But they're not actually personally aligned to what's it going to take to transform this organization. And a lot of times I see people who are really struggling with implementation or with change, and they'll say, well, of course the executives are on board because, they're paying for it. And to that, I just say, look at the data around gym memberships, right? Like conservatively, 60 to 70% of gym memberships never get used. So on an individual level, a lot of us are out there paying 50, 60, 70, maybe $100 a month for something that we never use, right? Like it's something that people do. We agree that things are a good idea. It's a good idea to have a gym membership, but we're not going to go out and use it. So I don't know about you, but I've done that sometimes, right?
Yeah.
There's plenty of things that we pay for that we're not actually aligned to doing. And so when you scale that to an executive level decision to engage in transformation, yes, they can outwardly be showing all of the signs of being engaged and being supportive. But the question that I try to think about is, have they actually shown that they are aligned to changing themselves in order to lead differently in the transformed organization? And I think that to me is the signal that this is going to go well and we're going to be able to drive this full throttle forward.
Right. What are some of what's an example of how you commonly see executives need to change themselves? Like what would a good example or common example be of that?
Yeah. An easy example might be with a ERP type of implementation. Sometimes it's the way that they're looking at the metrics for the business, because in their old system, they might have even simple things like the types of reports that they get or the way that data is organized and structured for them, right? So I have literally seen executives try and force the data into the old reporting format because that's where they're more comfortable. And they don't feel like changing how they look at the business data, because that takes time and effort and energy. And they're deeply habituated to how they've been looking at the data in the old system. And so they just want to keep going back to that. And until they really lean in and say, okay, I'm going to do this differently. I'm going to look at the data, look at the business data that's being generated by the ERP system in a different way. And they take on responsibility for going through that change themselves. It's very difficult to get traction in the implementation. So that's just a simple example.
Right.
There's plenty of others that I think people have probably seen.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from the audience. If you've seen examples of
Yeah.
executives that either needed to change their behavior or they should be changing their behavior, but they're not.
Yeah.
Love to hear comments from the audience, especially if you're not an executive or you're not a leader, but you're dealing with some issues at that level. That'd be interesting to hear as well. Um,
Yeah.
the audience is coming in hot with some questions already, so I want to get to one here from Kyler on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Kyler says, "How do you ensure alignment and not just agreement?" I think you sort of alluded to it a second ago, but maybe that we dive into that a little bit more. What's the difference, and how do you ensure that you get alignment, not just agreement?
Right. Yeah. In the first place, I will just say that, especially if you're trying to manage up, right? Like if you are in a situation where your leadership team, you feel like they agree, but they have not aligned themselves, it does require a different toolkit than what people use for change management. So change management toolkits are amazing for getting users, especially people who have to have their hands on the keyboard and using different systems, to do things differently. We've got great tools and resources for communication, for training, for gamification, for all of these different ways to get people engaged and excited. But that's usually not what the senior leadership team needs to really move into alignment around the change. What you need to drive alignment is a couple of things. One is to recognize that it's not one and done. You have to keep coming back to the leaders and make sure that they are changing their behaviors, and we call it starting with self, that they're willing to start with self and to say, I need to change how I lead in order for the transformation to be successful. And until leaders are visibly taking ownership and starting with self and changing how they lead, they're not in alignment. They're just agreeing that other people should change. And, we see this all the time. Eric, you and I were talking about it a couple of days ago, right? People are like, I'm happy for all of my people to change and to use this new system, but I'm not planning to change myself, right? People love to change other people. They don't really love to change themselves.
Good for you, not good for me, though.
Exactly, right. So it's really easy for executives or senior leaders to stay in that space of agreement. I agree that everyone else should change. Where you really see them moving into alignment is when they start to use the language of, and I'm changing too. And really holding them accountable to the changes that they need to make, which usually, by the way, do not involve learning the new system, right? Like they don't usually need to learn how to, actually use the system themselves, because they might not be at that place, but they're at a place where they use what comes out of the system. But really helping them to get articulate and clear about how they need to lead differently is one step towards getting them into alignment around the transformation.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, what about leadership during a transformation? And I think we're sort of dancing around this topic too, but I think it's worth going into. Is you've got the behavioral changes that need to happen that you mentioned, which is very important. You've got the alignment and the ongoing alignment that you need to have with the executive team. But what about during the transformation itself? How are executives' leadership styles typically challenged, and how do they need to rethink how they lead in general when they're going through a big digital or business transformation of any sort?
Yeah, it's a great question, Eric. And I think it plays to one of the comments, which is that in the adoption of a new system, IT leaders are always criticized by users. And I think that's kind of what you see, right? Is this, like, users are like, man, I'm having to do all the old stuff and do all the new stuff and go to this training, and I'm supposed to, participate in this focus group. And like, I think one of the things that leaders have to be really attentive to during times of transformation is how realistic are they being about the workload that's happening at a user level, right? At the people who are actually being going through the adoption process of the new system. Those people are learning a new technical skill, like they're learning how to do things differently. And leaders at that point are going to have to figure out how to lead differently by understanding what are the expectations that they're holding users to during that time of transformation. And Eric, I'm sure you see this all the time as an implementer, right? There's like this insanity around users should be able to continue to perform at the same levels that they've always performed, and also learn a whole new system and convert everything into the new system, right? Like, and.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I think where leaders get criticized is because users are like, these people have no idea what they're asking us to do.
Right.
And so getting really gritty about what are we actually asking people to do and how do we manage that workload in a different way is part of signaling a level of alignment rather than just theoretical agreement that this is a good idea and the end state sounds lovely,
Right.
right? Alignment is how do we walk that path?
Yeah. Yeah, an example that we commonly see nowadays, more so now than you would have seen maybe 5 or 10 years ago, is you think about AI as an example. You get artificial intelligence or machine learning or some sort of emerging technology that's really a game changer for how businesses can operate in the future. And it sounds good in theory when you say, okay, we're going to automate 50% of Julie's job. Now AI or machine learning is gonna or RPA, whatever it is, whatever the tech is, it's going to automate her job and it's going to be great. She's going to have so much more time on her hands to do other stuff, and we're going to be so much more efficient and effective, all this great stuff. But then you think, well, wait a minute, what's Julie going to do with the other 50% of her job? And someone has to decide that. We can't just put in new tech and assume that you're going to magically be more efficient and effective and everything's going to be great. Now we've got to figure out what to do with Julie's job. And that's where, in my opinion, where a lot of executives drop the ball, is they don't create that clarity of Julie's going to do this, and this is what her focus is going to be and how her job design is going to change to support the organization going forward. Is that something you see as well, or that you've run into throughout your career?
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, right? This idea of what happens next, right? And often we're encouraging executives to be very visible about the reality that sometimes action precedes clarity. Sometimes we have to get going, and then it will become clear what comes next, right? But if executives aren't engaged in that conversation on a regular basis and helping to see what comes next for those users and what happens with that other 50% of the time, and how do we make that effective and interesting and engaging for people, then people lose faith in the executive team and they'll say, well, they're just totally disconnected. They have no idea what's going on, right? And the other thing is that 50% that theoretically you're supposed to be able to gain, that gets filled up really, really quickly, right? And often executives don't even know what it's getting filled up with. And so that's an area where I think leaders can continue to demonstrate visible engagement in the transformation by talking with people and having those conversations about what's filling up your time, like what else is coming into the pipeline that we didn't expect or that we didn't even know about, or is it simply that you're doing more of maintenance work that we didn't anticipate with the automation of the system, right? Like all of these different questions. But when leaders aren't curious and they're not leaning into trying to understand that as it becomes clear, then they get very quickly disconnected. And that's when users get really frustrated. And they're like, like nobody really understands what's actually happening. How many times have you heard that from a user, right? Leaders don't know what's actually happening. Right. And that's because they've become disconnected, because again, they're in agreement. They think it's a great idea, but they're not walking the walk with their users.
Right. Great point.
Yeah.
And then, another thing or another dynamic that's common in transformations or any sort of time of change, whether it's a digital transformation or business transformation, is that, teams can get demoralized. They can suffer from change fatigue. They can just get tired. You lose morale and you get exhausted as a team sometimes when you're changing a lot or going through significant changes. What are some of the ways that you've seen executives, or let me rephrase the question, what are some of the strategies that you think executives should be employing more to keep their teams energized and to help navigate that whole change fatigue dynamic that we often see?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think one of the places where I see that fatigue happening, and especially in the frustration kind of starting to bubble over, and I think there was one comment in here. Let me just see if I can find it real quick. Yeah, I think executives have so much going on, they forget they approved the thing, right? Whatever it is that we're doing. I think that's such a great comment, because what that does, and Eric, we've talked about this, is it puts people on this crazy roller coaster of a cycle from a user perspective, right? The people that are deep in the organization that are basically coming in every day and dealing with the effort of transformation. And then there's a leadership team that gets all excited about it, and then their attention wanes and they go off and do other things. And then all of a sudden they get all excited about it again. And they're asking questions like, well, why aren't we further along? And how come this hasn't happened? And what's wrong with that? And why is this still broken? And the people who are, in the trenches are like, dude, we've been doing this, we're working our butts off every single day. Where have you been? Right.
Right.
And that is often, it's that whiplash effect that often creates that just utter fatigue for people. They're like, I can't go on this roller coaster ride one more time with these executives, because just because it's suddenly important to them doesn't mean it hasn't been important to us for the last 6 months, right?
Right.
And so, like, that spike in energy and attention and focus takes people on this crazy roller coaster ride that they don't, and they're just like, what do you mean? You don't understand why this is still not working. Like, we've been working so hard on it. So I think for executives or leaders who are involved in transformation, being really attentive to how they're energetically engaging and trying to keep that consistent rather than spiky, it goes a long way for the people in their organizations to say, okay, it might kind of like ramp up periodically. Like, as a leader, you can say, hey, we're coming into a board meeting next month, I'm going to need to say something like, let's get our act together, right? But if you've been consistently involved at a medium level of energy, let's call it, right, then people can manage that little spike. But if you're like high level and then you crater and you're off doing other more important things, and then you kind of like come back into it, that's when people kind of lose their minds, right? They're like, this feels terrible. And so for leaders, I would love to see them be more consistent in how they show up and how they're energetically engaged, and asking contextually appropriate questions, asking things that indicate that they know what's going on and they appreciate the effort that's happening. Like, how do they personally stay engaged in that? And that's not sponsorship, right? That's not funding. That's not like signing off on the invoice. That's not sending people to training. That's being personally committed and engaged energetically to the work that's happening in the organization.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great point, and really well said the way you just said that, because, so often, and I know you've seen this too, where you're in a project and you're dealing with the executive team and they give the green light to do a project. They sign the checks. Maybe they do an all employee email that they send out saying how important this project is. Maybe they do it in an all hands meeting to the whole company, and then they sort of fall off the face of the earth. You don't see them again or hear from them again until, there's a board meeting or some major milestone. And I think, to your point, there's a lot of like incremental, less glamorous ways that you have to be, executives need to be rolling up their sleeves and actively involved in the change and defining what you want to be when you grow up and defining what this organization is going to look like going forward. And too often they just view it as sort of like the way they treated Windows 98 upgrades back in the late 90s. It's like, yeah, we're just going to upgrade to Windows 98. No big deal. This isn't a Windows 98 upgrade. This is a massive change to your business, and someone has to define what that is and what that looks like in it. And that someone needs to be the executives. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that's exactly spot on. And it is not work that you can outsource to other people, right? You have to do it yourself. To go back to the gym metaphor, you can't have, pay for a trainer and then not show up for your trainer appointments and expect the trainer to do, the push-ups for you, right? Like, you actually have to show up and do them yourself. And it's an old metaphor, but it's an appropriate one, which is that for leaders to activate transformation, they have to show up for the transformation. And that means they have to carve time out of their very busy days so that they are doing actively engaged and visible in the transformation efforts that are happening in their organization. And I'll go back to the point that they have to figure out how they need to lead differently. And when we think about that, it's not just individual leaders, but also the leadership team. So we look at the mindsets, the group dynamics, as well as the organizational factors that are driving leader behaviors. And how do you make those visible? And how do you figure out which ones need to change?
Right.
And I think that for us is where the real richness is when we start to get leaders to identify the specific mindsets that they bring to their leadership that might need to be different in a transformed organization, the group dynamics that they have across the leadership team about who always makes their numbers, who wins, what does good look like for leaders, like all of these things. We start to really get to the heart of how do you help leaders to activate the transformation.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, what about when there's turnover in the middle of a project? And this is from Kyler on LinkedIn. And she says, we see a lot of executive turnover in the middle of a project, which, by the way, I'll just interject a comment here. I think this dynamic is increasing and accelerating. I think there's more turmoil in organizations in general, but then introducing fast pacing or fast changing and disruptive technologies is creating disruption to organizations, which oftentimes leads to more executive turnover. So we see a lot of executive turnover in the middle of the project, which can completely derail a project. What should you do if you garnered alignment but have a leadership change, which is a very common dynamic? What have you seen there?
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a great question, Kyler. So thank you for that. It is true. There's a lot of turnover at the executive level in all areas of business and in all roles, actually, not just the CIO or CTO or CEO, but across the executive suite. And it is a really challenging time. I think if there is a major transformation going on, it does depend a little bit on where you are in the transformation process. If you're very early on, that new executive may want to put a stop to things and say, I need to like wrap my arms around what's happening here. And so there's work to do to get them kind of sold on the transformation effort and the investment and what's happening. If it's really far down the road, then it may be about getting that new executive out into the field and hearing the voices of the users and getting them engaged in a visceral and visible way so that they really see what the future state, how close you are and what the future state is going to take. I think sometimes we miss that opportunity with new executives to get them grounded in both what has historically been the reality and what the future vision looks like. And they need to be able to connect those dots, even if they're new.
Right.
And so that often, by the way, like I've seen these, I see these executives come into new roles and they have like a stack of paper this high, but virtual now, so it's all digital, but they've got a stack of emails that goes on for days with all sorts of data and great information. They need that, but they also need to hear stories, right? They need to hear something that helps them put it in context. And so I would say, don't miss the opportunity to give these new leaders, these new executives access to the narrative, right? What's actually happening in the field with the users and tell those stories as effectively as possible. You need data. You also need stories in order to be able to have a full understanding of the context that you're coming into. And I think if you can do that with a new leader, then you start to drive alignment to the vision of the future much more quickly.
Right. Yeah. Makes total sense. What about sort of backing up, moving away from the turnover and the turmoil that's caused by executive turnover? If we back up and look to the beginning of a transformation when there's an evaluation happening and we haven't even really committed to a transformation necessarily yet, or at the very least, we don't know what technology or technologies we're going to be deploying, but we know we need to evaluate our options. What should the leader's involvement be in that evaluation before the transformation? And this question is from Nima on LinkedIn.
Yeah, thanks, Nima. I think we have an expression around Karrikins Group, the expression, if you build it, they will come. And we like to say, if you build it together, they will already be there.
Right.
And so if you are, I think in that upfront piece, the leadership team, especially if it's a major business transformation that will fundamentally change the way the business is run, the leadership team needs to be engaged and involved, not just in making the decision, like, is this which should we choose platform A or platform B or platform C? Like that is often best left to the people who are experts in that domain, whatever it might be. But they need to be involved in the decision that they too will change and that they too will need to do things differently as they go through this transformation. And so I think the more that you can do that work up front during the decision-making process, the better prepared the leadership team is for the work of changing themselves, right? How do they need to start with self and change? But often, unfortunately, and this is not a criticism of vendors, I think this is just a normal sales process, but vendors try to dial that down, right? Like they want it to sound easy and it's going to be no problem and there won't be any impact on you. But I think the responsibility of senior leaders is to say, clearly there's going to be an impact on us. And so let's talk about that. And how do we get more realistic about that?
Right. Yeah. And then, along those lines too, as we're defining that realistic roadmap to move forward, this is another question from Kyler on LinkedIn. Kyler says, that's a great topic. What happens when leadership has biases towards an emerging technology or a specific system? So on one hand, let's assume you've got some sort of alignment, but there's a bias that maybe, isn't best for the business, or there's a blind spot amongst the executive team. Yes, they're aligned, but they've got this big blind spot of what those expectations might be that you're just referring to. How do you navigate that dynamic?
Yeah, and I think that's a similar. I saw another question about there were a lot of employees quitting, and they knew it wasn't going to work, but the executives seemed kind of blind to that, right? And so when it feels like there's a mismatch between what will, let's just put it in quotes, actually work, and what decision is being made, right? I think again, you run into that situation where it feels like the executive team or the senior leaders or the decision makers are removed from the reality of the situation, or what can be what is believed to be the most effective path forward. And so if there's to Kyler's question, if there's a bias, and I'm sure, Eric, you see this in the work that you do because you're technology agnostic, right? Like you work with lots of different vendors, and you see the full spectrum of what can and can't work in different situations. And the one question that I like to ask leaders is there a preference because it feels the most comfortable and like it'll have the least amount of change for you? Or is there a preference because it suits where you want to take the business in the future, right? Like what's driving the bias or the preference? And then try and unpack that a little bit and figure out, is that a valid decision-making criteria? Or is that something that we need to make visible and then put to the side in a really specific way? But the key to me there is visibility. Like you've got to figure out what's driving the bias and what's driving the preference, or what's driving the belief that this is what we need to do, and then decide whether or not it's a valid influencer.
Right.
Is that, Eric, what you would typically do in that situation?
Yeah, it is. And also, along those lines, I'd say the bias, the most, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm totally losing the word. There's an adjective I'm just not finding in my head somewhere. But the more damaging bias, I guess you'd say, the more common bias is not so much like, hey, we want to go implement SAP, and I've got a bias for SAP or Microsoft or whatever. It's not the specific type of technology. It's usually more of a bias towards what you were mentioning a moment ago around expectations. Like, what is this transformation really going to look like? And one thing executives that I've seen that they fall prey to very commonly is the vendor sales messaging and the marketing messaging, because it all sounds so good. Like, it's like, that's exactly what I want. I want that easy button. And I want that technology that has pre-configured industry best practices and an accelerated implementation timeframe. It's going to mitigate risk. It's going to minimize costs. It sounds awesome. And as an executive, more commonly, I'm more likely to fall into that trap because I don't know. I'm not I'm not on the front lines doing this stuff every day. And so I think that bias is really the more common one that we see. It's not so much like I'm biased towards a technology, but rather I'm biased towards an unrealistic way of doing a transformation.
Yeah. And, I think it's so fascinating. It's such a great point that there is no easy button, right? I'm always telling executive teams this, like, it is going to be hard. And so we think of this, like this stat that 80% of digital transformations fail. Yeah, in part because of unrealistic expectations, right? Like people think, well, it should be easy, or people just have to start, flip the switch. We'll just flip the switch. And again, I'll go back to, if you are transforming your business, it will require leaders to lead differently. Like that to me is an inescapable fact. If you are going to continue to lead the business in the same way as you always have, then you have failed to transform your business. So transformation is not just getting a new system up and running. It's thinking about, how do we lead this business in a very different way? And I saw a question about whose responsibility is it to make sure that leaders are doing that, right? Well, it does start with the CEO or the president or the most senior leader acknowledging that, I need to do things differently. And as leaders, we need to do things differently. And here's the challenge though, what you need to do to lead differently that's not the same thing as users needing to learn a new system or a new process, right?
Mhm.
And so that's why, again, I'll go back to the importance of change management for the majority of the people in the organization who need to be taken on a change journey. But that's a very different set of tools than what it takes to help an executive team to stay aligned to the transformation and to how they need to lead differently. And that's the enduring question that, by the way, Karrikins Group is built to ask, right? That's why or built to answer. That's why I'm so passionate about it, because it is different than making sure that they're pushing out communications and that they're sending people to training and that they're doing all of their sponsorship jobs, right? They should do that. But there is another body of work that says we as a leadership team have to come together and figure out how we lead this transformed organization differently. And answering that question, I believe, or failing to answer that question holds back transformation, but answering it accelerates the success of transformations in all different ways, whether it's a technology transformation or an organizational redesign or a sales transformation or whatever it might be. Answering that question, I think, is a massive accelerator for transformations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and one thing, one word of advice that I can share with the audience just from my personal experience, and I'd be curious to see what you think of this, Julie. But I've told this story a million times on this podcast before, but I'll tell it again because it's relevant here. And that is that when I first met my wife, at the time she had 2 kids, right? They were 2 and 5 years old, and we ended up getting married, obviously. And I quickly realized, wait, I'm going to be a dad too, right? So I need to figure out like how to be a parent because I had no idea what I was doing. And some might argue I still have no idea what I'm doing. But 12 years ago, when we first met and got engaged and everything, I went and bought the book Love and Logic, and it's a book. It's basically child psychology, and it's about how to raise kids and how to give them choices and options.
Mhm.
So, rather than having a authoritarian style of parenting, where they're more likely to push back and rebel as they get older, you give them choices. And obviously the psychology is that you give them choices that are acceptable to you, or
Yeah.
you give them one really bad choice that obviously they're not going to want, and you give them the choice that you want and that's
Yeah.
more appealing to them.
Yeah.
So the reason I bring all this up is I learned a lot about parenting through that book, but I also found that it's highly effective with executives too. Not that you need to treat executives like children necessarily, but
Mhm.
it gets back to the basics of human psychology of, okay,
That's
you
right.
want the easy button. Okay, you can have the easy button, but here's what it's going to look like. Here's what the outcome's
Yeah.
going to look like if you go the easy button route. Or you could go the path that you're describing, that you're advocating. I think you and I are both advocating in this conversation, which is it's hard work. You got to roll up your sleeves. You've got to be involved, engaged, all that stuff. And here's what that outcome looks like. And so you pick a path. And instead of saying, well, I want the easy button and the positive outcome and the really good outcome, you can't
Right.
have that. They don't coexist in the same world. So you pick one, whatever one you want. You can have either
Yeah.
option. And so I
Yeah.
find that that can be very effective is to paint a picture to executives of what their actions or lack of actions or different scenarios of what their actions might look like. How does that play out over time? And is that something you guys deal with in terms of educating and sort of helping them see what could be if they do
Yeah.
or don't do certain things?
Yeah. We tell them, you have to choose your hard. Choose which hard you want.
Right.
It's hard being where you are right now because your competition is smoking you and your customers aren't that thrilled and your employees are struggling, right? So that's hard. Where you are right now is hard. And transforming is going to be hard. So which hard do you want? Like there is no easy option, right? Like, so
Right.
we don't even put the easy button on the table, right? Like if you want to keep going the direction that you're going, that's going to be tricky. Or you go through this transformation and you get where you need to go, knowing that for a period of time it's going to get really hard, but then it's going to get better, right? And so how do you lean into that? And I think that framing can help executives to do the work that they need to do. And then, I always tell leadership teams, and you've heard me say this before as well, Eric, organizations cannot transform while leaders are busy doing far more important things,
Right.
right? Like it's not going to happen. So if leaders aren't willing to take the time to commit to to having the conversations with each other about how do we need to lead differently, then because they're far too busy doing far more important things, then they are failing their duty in terms of the transformation of the organization. And that's a tough message for leadership teams because they do feel like they're very busy and very important and they have a lot of time pressures. And they have very big jobs and they have very important things that they need to do. But the transformation of the organization that they're asking their people to do is an absolute priority, or it should be a priority. And where they demonstrate their alignment to that prioritization is when they decide to spend the time to figure out as a leadership team, how do we answer the question, how are we going to lead differently in the transformed organization?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sort of building on the easy button concept and want that we all have, including executives. This is from Kyler on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Kyler says, building on that, we often see executives saying, my company is completely ready for change. The teams will be so excited because they're so detached from reality. And the organization is in fact scared of the change. And I'll take it one step further and say that, we commonly see executives that are right when they say that the team and the rest of the organization is excited for change. On the surface, they might be 100% correct that the team is excited and ready for change. But the problem is you start to peel back the onion of what change means and how people are going to be impacted. And it becomes a threat that people get scared of over time. Inevitably, it seems to always happen where they start off excited early in the project. They're, the excitement level is way up here. And then as you get into the details of the change, it starts to drop off. And then in many cases, people start to push back, or at the very least, they aren't supporting the change because now they're uncertain of what their future holds for them in this new transformation world that we're going to go through. So how do you deal with that? I mean, how have you seen organizations deal with that in the past?
Yeah. I think it's funny from a social science perspective, right? It makes a lot of sense. As long as it's conceptual, it sounds great. But when it comes to like, okay, I've got to wake up and do something different, now it's hard, right? And so I think the closer it gets to impacting you personally, the higher the anxiety level goes. And that's where change management tools really come into play, right? Like, how do we bring people on that journey? How do we have consistent communication? How do we get them into training at the right time? All of those things. I think, though, most people in most organizations, if you've been in the workforce for a minute, you've been on a failed transformation effort, right? You have watched your leadership team get all excited about something, and you've taken on all the extra work and tried to make it happen, only to have the leadership team get distracted by something else, or decide that it's not the right direction, or lose interest, or whatever, or have a change out in leadership team. And now suddenly you're heading in a different direction, right? And I think, when we think about what generates excitement for people and how people can buy into things, one of the things that we know works really well is when leaders share their own stories, right? And being authentic and being willing to say, I know we've asked you to go on this ride before. And, we know that there has been previous experiences where we've lost sight of the end goal, or we haven't fully committed to the transformation, or whatever that might be. And here's how this is going to be different. And here's what you can look for. Here are the signals you can look for to know that we're still fully committed. And we're going to keep showing up, right? The more that leaders can be out in front of that fear that we're going to buy in and we're going to get all excited, and then you're going to let us down as a leadership team, right? That's where people get really anxious, is when they perceive that leader energy and attention has gone elsewhere, and now the transformation is going to flop again, right?
Right.
And so they don't want to do that. They don't want to stay on that crazy train, right? And so they opt out. But the more that leaders can get ahead of that and stay, again, visibly, actively engaged in how they're changing, not just how they expect other people to change, the more people can stay confident that leaders are still there, that they're still present, that they're having that really consistent energy level around the transformation, rather than juicing it and then dropping it, and then juicing it and then dropping it. And then people just get exhausted with that.
Right. Now, what about this dynamic, which I imagine you've probably seen in your career, but this is from Varun on LinkedIn. Varun says, I've seen people turn passive aggressive, which can derail the transformation. Change management is a critical component, and timely alignment with executive leaders is a key. What are your thoughts on that comment?
Yeah, Varun, that passive aggressive behavior, I've definitely seen it, Eric. I'm sure you have as well. Yeah, in plenty of times. And I agree with you. That's where change management tools can really be very powerful. They can help bring that to the surface and make it visible. It does take leadership alignment and leadership engagement, I think, to push through that passive aggressive behavior and be willing to. Executives sometimes have to make very hard decisions if they really want to transform the organization. I'll give you a great example that I've seen plenty of times. Eric, how many sales transformations have you seen? In like
dozens. I mean,
dozens.
Of
Yeah,
ones focused on
so
sales.
many. Yeah, so many, right? And inevitably in a sales transformation, there can be a situation where you have a rainmaker, right? Someone who's such a great salesperson, and they're just like, nope, I'm opting out of this. Like, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. And I'm just going to keep, making my numbers. And as long as I make my numbers, I don't have to change. And that's that passive aggressive behavior, right? They're like, oh, nominally it's a good idea, but don't get in my way, right?
Right.
Sometimes it's not even passive, right? Sometimes
Right.
it's just
Sometimes
like
it's
full on, yeah. Sometimes it's just full on aggressive. So when you see that situation, the only way to manage that is for an executive sometimes to be willing to make some really hard choices about that individual or how that person is showing up. And they might be a really valued colleague or really valued resource. They might be a really important part of your revenue puzzle, right? But the way in which executives help the change management team to deal with that situation is a really visible symbol to the rest of the organization about how serious they are about the transformation. Because if you believe in the transformation effort and in the future state being better than the current state, then that means that everybody, even your rainmakers, have to go along for the ride. And so those kinds of examples, I think, are really important to look for. And how do you create visibility around those passive aggressive or aggressive aggressive behaviors and make sure that executives are involved and engaged in helping to move forward with them and not just leave it up to the change management team to try and figure out.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you bring up a really interesting point because I think that during transformations, we often assume that the highest performing people and those A-team players are going to be the most supportive. They're the ones that are most on board, and they're going to be sort of our change agents and our faces of change and all that stuff. And that may be true, and that may be a possibility and a good thing to shoot for. But what ends up happening in a lot of, especially in like highly manual work environments where there's not a lot of automation, and we're thriving through heroics and tribal knowledge, and it's the stuff in my head that's making me successful, and it's the stuff that I do to overcome these crappy systems I have. That's what's making me successful. And so those heroics create this false sense of, because I'm such a team player and I'm such a high performer, I'm probably going to be on board with the change more than others. And I'm probably going to be a good change agent or a face of change. But the reality is I might be the one to most likely push back on the change, not because I want to sabotage the project or sabotage the company, but because now my heroism is at risk, because now you're going to automate the job. You're going to put in better tools that other people could be just as good as me in my job. And so it's a sort of a loss, or a perceived loss, that a lot of times your A players experience in these sorts of transformations. Have you seen that before, and if so, how do you see organizations overcome that dynamic?
Yeah, I think identity is a very real factor in change, right? So how deeply do I identify with the way that we've always done things and my role in that? And people can see very clearly how they fit in the existing organization. But there's an old expression, right? We can always see what we stand to lose, but we can't envision what we stand to gain. It's very difficult to envision what you stand to gain. And so I think there is a sense of loss that comes with transformation. And there is a sense of concern around, where do I fit in and what's my role and how do I contribute in the transformed organization? Most people, they want to grow and they want to contribute, right? Like, those are two really fundamental things that people want to do in an organizational structure. And they know how to do that in the existing system, even if it's a bad system.
Right.
And they don't know how to do that in the transformed system. And so, again, I'll go back to something I said earlier. Action precedes clarity in these cases, right? Sometimes you have to just start moving there so that you can start to see the future. But the role of change management often is to help people bridge that space between the old and the new, and to get them to take the actions that they need to take to create the clarity about where they fit in. You can create clarity about what's the new process and what, what's the data entry or what's the manual process that you're going to do that'll be automated. But it's the clarity about where do I fit in and how do I continue to be a valued part of this group that I think is the sticking point for a lot of people in those situations that you've described.
Right.
And so leaders can play a role in that by sharing their own story about how is it confusing for them about where they fit in the future. And by the way, leaders, I think part of why we don't see leader alignment and activation in times of transformation is because leaders can't bridge that gap. They know how to solve the problems of today and how to lead effectively. And in the current system is how they got promoted. And so if we're going to change the system, where do they fit in? And how do they continue to be successful leaders? So they're on their own bridge across those 2 points, right? And the more that they can share that, like the more that we can help them to, again, make visible those mindsets, those group dynamics that they're struggling to change, and help them to articulate that in an effective way, then they can start to really lead the way for others to do the same.
Right.
But it's a challenging thing. Like I said, there is no easy button. There's only hard or hard.
Right.
You have to choose between those two hards.
Yeah. Which one do you want and which one you're willing to support? Here's another really interesting point from Kyler on LinkedIn. Sometimes aggressive resistance is the best kind because you can see it and then you know what to do at that point. But it's the quiet resistance that is deadly to a project. And I could not agree more with that. It's that more subtle, like I'm not full on sabotaging the project. I'm not full on being difficult, but I'm not super excited about it either. And I'm not really supporting it as much as I could. It's that sort of middle ground that seems to be the hardest to detect and to address. Would you agree with that? And if so, what are some strategies to overcome that dynamic?
I totally agree with that. I think I'm always happy when somebody says, I do not agree with this. I'm not going to do it. You're like, okay, right. I can work with that. Right. Here's the funny thing is we like to point, so sometimes kind of point fingers at people like the doers in the organization that are in that space. And again, from a Karrikins Group perspective, we see that behavior from a leadership space. And it is often, at a senior leadership level, they're like, well, give me a call when it's done. Right. There's like that kind of attitude. Right. And I think that's being able to make that visible. We talk about making the invisible visible. And whether it's with, someone who's in a mid-level or doer level in the organization who is exhibiting that kind of quiet resistance or not exhibiting it, and you have to discover it, or it's at a leadership level, visibility is the key, right? Like you have to bring it out of the dark and into the light. You have to be able to give words to it. You have to be able to give shape to it. And I'll go back to something I talked about earlier, which is the power of storytelling, right? Being able to have not just the data, because data is one important tool, but being able to give examples and show, kind of talk in stories around here's the situation and here's where we're seeing this quiet resistance. And here's the kind of attitude or the belief structure that people are bringing into it. That can start to make that more visible and more manageable. So I would really encourage people to lean into that idea of what are the stories that help make this example visible and accessible to people, rather than just going after data that you can hammer people with.
Right. And here's a question from William on YouTube, which is sort of along the same lines here. But William asked the question of, when you're working with executives who have low respect among employees and difficulty getting buy-in, do you try to solve historical cultural issues out front or just move forward with your plan? And I love this question because it's, back to your point, it's not an easy answer and there's no easy path forward. But what do you do here in this case?
William, that's when, like you go unlock the safe and you pull out your magic fairy dust and you throw it out. You're just like, this will fix it. No, it's such a great question, William. And you're right. It is so hard when you have an executive who's already kind of broken faith with the employee population, or they've been on the roller coaster before, and they have maybe the executive has a reputation for being flighty, like shiny object syndrome or whatever. And I do believe that it is important to get ahead of those cultural norms, right? Those like deeply held beliefs about how this organization manages transformation. And by the way, I've seen from a social science perspective, it's fascinating. These stories permeate generations in an organization. So you can have an organization where they had a failed transformation 10 years ago, and 50% of the employee population wasn't there when that happened, but they'll tell you, oh, the reason we're not good at transformation is because, yeah, fairy dust is underrated. The reason they're not good at transformation is because 10 years ago we tried that and it didn't work. And you're like, you weren't even here. How do you know that story? It's because stories replicate through time, right? People keep telling the same stories over and over again. And so you have to get to what are the organizational stories or beliefs about transformation, and even about this CEO or this leadership team, right? What are the stories people keep telling? And then how do we start to deconstruct those stories instead of how do we convince people that this time is going to be different, right? So I do believe, William, that there is value in understanding those cultural norms and those stories that are being replicated about the leadership team. Sometimes it's just like the ambiguous leader, right? Like, but what are those beliefs that are out there and how do we give voice to them? And then how do we start to reshape those narratives in an effective way? And that can be much more effective than just trying to convince people through, great marketing that this time is going to be different.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very well put. And that's a great question. So I guess just to summarize as sort of a capstone question here, let's say I'm part of an organization that is struggling with getting the organizational buy-in and support I need, and or I'm not getting the alignment I need from the executive team and mid-level management all the way, down the org, which trickles down the organization. What closing advice or sort of next steps or first steps would you suggest to organizations that are dealing with some of these executive alignment and buy-in sorts of issues?
Yeah. I think first and foremost is clarity around the sponsorship role. Executives absolutely need to engage as sponsors of the transformation in visible ways, and there are change management tools and resources for doing that. So that is important. However, it's insufficient for them as executive sponsors they can't just sit in the sponsor role. They have to actually do the work as leaders and as a leadership team to figure out for themselves how they're going to lead differently. And that is not the same as sponsoring the change for other people. So asking them how they're going to change how they lead. And if they don't have a good answer for that, then helping them get to a good answer for that is really important. And how they're going to lead differently starts with what are their mindsets and deeply held beliefs about how they're leading today, and what's great about how they're leading today, and what is lacking, and how they're going to close those gaps as they go forward. And then finally is understanding across the leadership team, what are the group dynamics that are driving their behaviors as leaders, and how do those group dynamics need to be reshaped in a transformed organization? And I would simply remind them that if the organization is transforming, they cannot continue to lead the way that they've led historically. If they can continue to lead the way they've led historically, they have not transformed the organization. Right. So I think that, getting that message across to them is a really important step in this process. And like I said, I understand that it is a different set of tools and it is a different methodology, leader activation, than change management. Change management is a very specific discipline. And this idea of how do we activate leaders around it requires having different kinds of conversations with a different group of people. And so I would just say, don't try and point your change management tools at executive leaders. It likely will not work.
Right. Good point. And you have a resource that we can all access to help us learn more about this topic, right? Tell us a little bit about that.
Out on our website, we have a set of coffee breaks, and there's one specifically about leader activation. So if you want to visit that, there's some resources out there and a PDF download that has some ideas and some tricks and tips for driving leader activation. And we'd love to chat with anyone who's interested in knowing more about it.
Yeah, and we'll we'll ask our marketing team to drop it in the chat as well, and I'll share it on the screen here in just a moment, just so you have a link to it. But it's your website is karrikinsgroup.com. Is that correct?
Yep. Karrikinsgroup.com.
How do you spell Karrikins, just so everyone knows?
Yep. Karrikins. Karrikinsgroup.com. And, we partner with implementers. We partner with change management people. We are, like I said, very specific in the work that we do and very tight around it. And we love to just help people be successful with their transformations. So any way that we can be in service, we're here to help.
Great. Well, thank you. I really appreciate you being here. That time flew by, but we could easily spend a couple more hours on this topic. But we appreciate you helping us sort of scratch the surface and start to dig into some of this stuff in a little bit more detail. And really appreciate you being here on the show today, Julie.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. And thank you to the audience for being here today. Really appreciate all of your engagement and questions and support of this discussion. You can learn more again about Julie and her company at karrikinsgroup.com. You'll be able to find the polished version of this discussion along with other content on next week's episode of Transformation Ground Control. You can go to transformationgroundcontrol.com to view and listen to all the episodes of this show that we've done over the last few years. So be sure to check that out. Again, that's transformationgroundcontrol.com. And this is a live discussion we do every Tuesday. So thank you for being here. We have different guests every Tuesday. We do this live production at the same time, same place, streaming to the same platform. So be sure to check us out every Tuesday where we do this live production. So thank you very much, Julie, for being here. Thank you to the audience. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you next time. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.